We will move on now to Rabbi Bryan Kinsburner, who is a board-certified chaplain and the Director of Religious and Spiritual Services for the Oscar and Ella Wilf Campus for Senior Living in Somerset, New Jersey, and the President of Nishama, Association of Jewish Chaplains. He's a graduate of Yeshiva University with a BA in History and an MA in Jewish Studies, focusing on Jewish mysticism. He's here to talk to us on the topic of evolution in chariots from war vehicles to symbols of the divine, a proposal for how the phrase Ma'asa Mekbah became the description of Jewish mysticism. Rabbi, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, everybody, for having me. This is actually my first opportunity to speak in a setting such as this, in an academic conference, and I'm very excited and hope that I have something to contribute. So let me share my screen and we will get started. So let's kind of frame this as such. Which I'll show you in a moment, there's a text that tells us in the Talmud about different types of study and limitations on the number of people who can be taught these kinds of studies. And what we're going to see is that one of those studies, this Maser Merkava, or the account of the chariot, seems to come, in the one hand, is very well known. We all have heard this phrase because it's always immediately attributed to the first chapter of Ezekiel, but it doesn't necessarily jive with a lot of what we then later on define as Jewish mysticism. And my goal here is to kind of take us a step back and, I guess, put our heads in the minds of those that are coming up with this phrase for this form of study to say, how did we get here? How did we get from a vehicle to something much more esoteric? And as we'll go through this presentation, we'll see some imagery, we'll see some examples from the Bible. There are post-biblical examples from the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, which are not part of this. We'll see a couple of one of my most favorite modern renditions of the entire storyline of the first chapter of Ezekiel, and why they make this connection, even though that first chapter actually never uses the word for chariot. It just kind of speaks around it. So let's begin. The second chapter of the Babylonian tractate of Chagiga begins with a Mishnah, begins with a teaching that seems out of place for the entire study line, the entire tractate, because it is really based upon, the entire tractate is based upon sacrifices brought during the holidays and some of the processes of how they would bring the sacrifices to the temple in Jerusalem. The end of the first chapter speaks about this term Araya, which has to do with sexual relations. And immediately thereafter, because it's an oral tradition, they tie that word into some other teaching that's really out of place here. And it says as follows. This is only part of this first Mishnah, but it's really our focus for here. Ein dorshim b'arayat b'shlosha. We don't expound on the topic of forbidden sexual relations before 3 or more individuals. Below Maaseh Bereshit b'shnayim, and then the act of creation, we don't expound before 2 or more individuals. And below b'merkava yachid, and nor does one expound upon the accounting or the design of the divine chariot, except in a one-on-one setting, and that's only if Ela im ken haya chacham maybe midato, and the person has to be wise and understanding and somehow have a knowledge base that will be able to understand these things beyond, let's assume, the simple reading of the text. And I say let's assume that because that's actually a debate about how to interpret this teaching in academic scholarship, is the question of whether or not these 3 topics are the literal topics of not speaking about Leviticus 19 and other sections that speak about all those sexual relationships that are considered to be forbidden in the holiness codes, and Maaseh Bereshit being the story of creation, how to not really going into the depths of that, but kind of taking it at face value, and this Merkava, this chariot story, being the literal reading of the first chapter of Ezekiel. Others will tell you, and I think very clearly from this, that there's a deeper sense about the third one, and I actually argue there's a deeper sense about all 3, where each category here of the forbidden sexual relations, the creation story, and the Merkava story are all different parts of an esoteric, what we now call a mystical tradition, dealing with how does humanity relate or connect to God. There's some literature that speaks about how this is maybe a polemic against Gnostic ideology, saying that we don't speak about this publicly except in these small groups. And there's another teaching in a different Mishnah that speaks about how we don't read some of these things publicly, specifically the Merkava, or the question of whether or not we should. And that's why I think that this goes way beyond just literal text and goes into some deeper subjects. But again, our focus here is on the third one, which is the chariot. And the question is, why is this chariot so mysterious that we don't really talk about it, except in, if you will, I guess you can put it in modern terms, in a hush-hush kind of way? Obviously, in today's time, we have everything is public, so it's very hard to speak to it in a one-to-one sort of model. But back then, based on the fact that most things were either oral or scribe or manuscript, and your literacy levels were much lower, you could really keep certain information to just the select few. But let's get into that. What is this chariot? Why a chariot? Sorry, using two different screens here. And so first, in order to do that, what is a chariot? Let's talk about chariots in terms of what do we know from the ancient Near East? What do we see image-wise before we get into the text? So the first one in front of you are examples of Hittite war chariots that were found in Turkey, that are sitting, that are in some of the reliefs that remained. And you can see here, right? So the wheels are important, how it's being drawn, the number of people that are there. The next image, which I want to take a moment on, is from Egypt. It's a picture of Ramses III, and who's dressed in, I'm going to try to make this a little, let me see if I can make it larger. No, I cannot. All right. Ramses III is sitting there, and if you look carefully towards the bottom, you'll actually see like an imagery of part of a wheel. Apparently this image is Ramses sitting on the back of the wheel, the chariot, which has now become his throne, and is being and being brought to him is our captives and the various proofs of the victory in the battle. What's important in this picture, not as just the chariot, but that a king, and in the ancient world, of course, the king, the pharaoh, and other societies was a representative of a god, is sitting on the back of the chariot. The chariot becomes the throne. And in this particular picture, it's hard to see, but you have solar discs around, and we'll come back to that in a moment, the idea of the sun, right? So Pharaoh being the sun god in this context and other contexts as well, as you'll see on the next slides. Here's an image of a sun chariot from Denmark. The sun being the orb, of course, being drawn by the horse, and the wheels again will come, chariots. Another one, more well-known, Greek Helios on his sun chariot. And another picture of that. The chariot was not just the vehicle to go out to war, but it was a representation of how a god would travel. A god has to travel in style. You can imagine, if we were depicting it today, what that would potentially look like. Where does Ezekiel get the imagery from? In his own mind, right? A vision is going to be some sort of, whether one takes a very, an imagery of prophecy in its most literal sense, or some sort of dream-like image or vision-like image, you're going to learn it from somewhere. And many claim that Ezekiel, in his own mind, saw this from, for example, from these, Lamasu, which are protective deities, a hybrid of a human head on the body of an ox or a lion. This is a better side view. You see the wings again. These are found in different places: Mesopotamia, Nineveh, Persepolis, other places that guard the gates. But again, this sort of divine or semi-divine or palace imagery is clearly in the mind of our text that we're going to see soon. And of course, the Kruvim, the cherubim, again, the wings are going to be part of this as well. Overall, the idea being that the imagery that is being pictured by Ezekiel for his text and subsequently by the rabbis when they take this idea a step further is not coming out of nowhere. It's not coming out of thin air. It's coming out of the cultures around them. And is being incorporated into their own culture. This is just one example you see in the middle. This is a mosaic that was found outside of a kibbutz called Beit Alpha. And in the middle square around the zodiac is the imagery of, there's four, they say there's four, so outside is four women of the entire square. This is the middle square of this bigger mosaic. And in the center is a man pictured driving a 4-horse chariot, 4 animals. Through the moon and the stars and the rays of the sun were coming out of his head. It was clear that this was an imagery of the Greek god Helios. A lot of mosaics were what they, of course we use the term Hellenistic. They were a combination of some what we now would call, right, so Jewish ideology and Greek or other ideology coming together in this image, this artistic rendering. And again, the sun god playing a central role in this context, not as a depiction of what, that's obviously going to be part of the question. Just a couple pictures here of what Ezekiel might have seen. These are more modern renditions, right? You see God being right on a throne, sort of being ensconced in the sun. Towards the bottom, you see the wheels, you see the animal, and this is the vision that he's seeing. That's one example. Here's another rendering from the 18th century, again, similar. But in all these, this godlike picturing is being placed within a sun. I think part of the imagery that's coming out is, well, the sun gods of the ancient world, what are they traveling on? As we saw, they're traveling on the chariot. Before we get into the text, I also want to give you a more modern rendition of what Ezekiel may have been speaking of, or at least one of my more favorite speculations. In the 1970s, there was an author by the name of Eric von Daniken, and he wrote these books called Chariots of the Gods. And what he presumes is that Ezekiel's visions were not localized visions, but they were actually a global vision. And the chariot, which eventually takes him to see certain these images of a temple, and as described later in Ezekiel, how did he travel? Well, in the ancient world, you would have spoken of a flying chariot, which is what it describes. In the modern world, you would speak of a spaceship, helicopter, airplane, right? So if we were picturing how a modern leader would travel, Air Force One, just as an example, or this fun picture here, right? See the spaceship. The influences around us help formulate the imagery in our minds. And here, of course, is Ezekiel's imagery that we're going to see. But how do we get there from the Bible? And this presumes, of course, this was presuming a linear, step-by-step, Genesis, Exodus, and so on, historical, right, rendering. And so in Genesis, we, of course, see how the importance of the chariot in the story of Joseph, that when Joseph, after interpreting the dreams, when the Pharaoh wants to appoint Joseph the second in command, one of the things that he does is he has him riding the chariot and people crying out to him, Avarech, or blessing onto you. And this is a way of signifying that this person's status is now raised up. They're not just a minister, but there's something special about them. Book of Kings, the story of Elijah and Elisha. Elijah is taken up to the heavens in a fiery chariot with fiery horses that appear out of the heavens in a whirlwind. That term comes up in Ezekiel as well. And Elisha sees this and he cries out, Father, Father, Israel's chariots and horsemen. the ascent. And what does it look like when he's ascending to heavens? He's ascending into the sun. A little later on, Elisha has a very similar situation where they're going out to war. The Arameans are at war with the king of Israel. They're trying to capture the prophet Elisha. And the attendant of the man of God rose early, went outside. He saw a force with horses and chariots surrounding the town. What are we going to do? Have no fear, Elisha responds. They're more on our side. And what does he see? Right? What does he do? He prays that God should open the eyes. And what do they see? They see God's the chariots of fire. A few chapters later in the story of Josiah, when he's trying to remove all the idolatry, he did away with the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun at the entrance of the house of the Lord near the chamber of the eunuch Nathan Melech, who was in the precincts. And what did he do? He burned the chariots of the sun. The chariots of the sun are not just something of the earth. There's something beyond that. There's something of an imagery that goes higher. Book of Jeremiah speaks of chariots coming, the vision that the chariots mark Kivotav, Kalum and Esharim, right? They come out of a whirlwind. The horses are swifter than eagles. So the horses, probably we can picture horses with wings in this context as well. We'll go on to Isaiah. Again, chariots are like a whirlwind to vent his anger and fury. This is speaking of a God imagery. So let's go to Ezekiel. What is he seeing? And there's 6 pieces. Something coming out of a whirlwind, animal images, wheels, a form above the creatures, the wings of the wings, and of course the throne with God sitting on it. Step by step, let's go one at a time. 4th verse of that first chapter. I looked, and lo, a stormy wind came sweeping out of the north. And in the Hebrew ruach sarah, which should automatically be a hint to what Elijah and Elisha experienced when Elijah is being taken out, coming out of the whirlwind, something's coming forth. In their context, it was a chariot, or it says the word chariot. Here, of course, is first the imagery of these 4 animals, reminiscent, of course, of the mosaic, which is later depicted or thought of in that mosaic that we saw as well, and also depicted in some of the other imagery of the chariot and the sun. Right? And so each of these images, they have figures of human beings, but each had 4 faces and 4 wings. The legs of each were a rigid leg, reminiscent of the statues guarding the palace that we saw before. The feet of each were like a single calf's hoof, and their sparkle was like the luster of burnished bronze. Human hands below the wings. Each wing, right? So go to the last verse here. Human face at the front, and each had the face of a lion, ox, and eagle. 4 different faces on each one, or at least that's what he envisioned. A few verses later, of course, wheels. So this should already hint to some sort of vehicle, if that didn't before. I saw 1 wheel on the ground next to each of the 4-faced creatures. As for the appearance and the structure of the wheels, they gleamed like beryl, all 4 of the same form. The appearance and structure of each was as of 2 wheels cutting through each other. There's a form above the heads of the creatures, something beyond. And then, of course, the wings. Under the expanse, each had 1 pair of wings extended towards those of the others. Each had another pair covering its body. Again, the pictures we saw before. When they moved, I could hear the sound of their wings like the sound of mighty waters, like the sound of Shaddai. And then finally, the throne with God sitting on it. From what appeared as his loins up, I saw a gleam as of amber, light imagery, what looked like a fire encased in a frame. And from what appeared as his loins down, I saw what looked like fire. There was a radiance all about him, like the appearance of the bow which shines in the clouds on the day of rain. Like the rainbow, such was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. That was the appearance of the semblance of the presence of God, of the Lord. When I beheld it, I flung myself down on my face. So let's put this picture together. We have something coming out of the whirlwind. So we have to look up. We have the faces of the animals, reminiscent of some of the imagery, past, future. We have wheels, which should automatically hint to us a vehicle, and the wheeled vehicle then that might be traveling would be a chariot, but not named as such. We have, let me go back 1 second. We have a form above the creatures. We have the winged imagery, and of course, finally, looking up towards the radiant light which is symbolized by the sun, throne with God sitting on it. So what does this all mean? This all, of course, means the imagery of chariots that they saw around the world. So when the rabbis then later on are speaking about the account of the chariots, which they are hinting to this chapter specifically, at least that's the interpretation that everybody kind of goes with, and then the subsequent literature that became known as the Heichalot literature, which is the palace literature, which speaks of ascents to heaven, and which also we see in the pseudepigrapha and the books of Enoch, which reminiscent, of course, of the verse in Genesis, where Enoch is brought up to God, and in Genesis, he's only 365 years old, which should hint to, of course, 365 days of the solar year. Again, sun imagery. It's very clear why they go to that term of Merkava. They are looking at different forms of esoteric ideas, and they're trying to say, what can we not teach? What do we have to be careful with teaching? This picture of ascending to the sun, they don't want a sun god, right? So God in their imagery already is something overarching, which of course later on becomes an imagery of non-imagery. There's no image of God, which is later Jewish thinking over the centuries. But they're picturing a certain kind of esoteric knowledge, which a vehicle that will take somebody up to the heavens. And then what they speak of later on is your day Merkava, which is then descending back down from heaven. And I think that rabbinic scholarship then expands upon this to take it beyond just the literal, okay, they're going up to heaven, or they're going up to the sun, but they're going up to the heavens, or they're going through it in some sort of meditative state, which of course we speak about over the centuries and study as what in the more modern Jewish mystical traditions. And then finally, why do I bring all this up is I think that what they're picturing and what Ezekiel himself is picturing, speaking in a language that we would understand, those that are reading it, is what is the societal and cultural influences that play, how they played a role in how they perceive their imagery, and then of course how they spoke a language. And in this context, that language is the language of chariots. So that, in short, is my thought for today, that takes us sort of from the end and brings us back around through somewhat of a chronological line through the biblical text to the rabbinic text, and then of course subsequently the centuries developing an entire corpus of thought, which we don't have the time to go into, of Jewish mysticism or mysticism in general. So there you have it.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I appreciate you taking the time to present your research to us.
Well, you're very welcome. It was my pleasure.